Can the Falcons truly afford to trade back in round one?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay tuned for the Armada Player of the Week later in today's show. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, podcasting for over a decade here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. And of course, I appreciate each and every one of you that hangs out here on Locked On Falcons as everydayers. That means you make this humble podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are joined by Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta, and we're going to talk about what's the deal with the cornerback position for the Atlanta Falcons and start the conversation. Yeah, that's that's how they say it. And start the conversation on. We're already off to a great start today. Start the conversation on what are the Falcons' options in the second round, because we spend all of our energy talking about the first round. But because we're spending so much energy talking about the first round, we're going to talk about the first round to start off today's episode and talk about the trade back possibilities. This is something that I have been thinking about these last couple of days. I've been firmly on team trade back, that if you can get a viable trade back for the Falcons and accumulate more assets in this year's draft, it totally makes sense for the Atlanta Falcons. We know that Terry Fontenot has not been that keen on trading back. He traded back in his first draft in round 2, but we've seen evidence of the Falcons getting phone calls in round 1 from teams looking to move up, and Terry Fontenot will be like, "Nah, I'm good. We're going to stick and pick at this point in time." And so given that background, coupled with the reality of this draft class where you have the Falcons picking at 15, and then there's a couple of teams picking immediately after them that are presumably could be in the market for picking up edge rushers. A team like Arizona, despite signing Josh Sweat, could always use more help in the pass rush. What a novel concept, Jarvis. Teams looking to add more and more to the pass rush and never being satisfied with that. The Cincinnati Bengals picking at 17. We know that they're pass rush situation is very much in flux with Trey Hendrickson and his future, not necessarily knowing where he'll be playing this upcoming season. And then you have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers picking at 19. There's been a team that has been connected with a player like Donovan Ezeraku out of Boston College. I've heard a lot of speculation about him being sort of a guy that they would be more than willing to pull the trigger on at pick 19. And so, I've seen a lot of talk of, when we talk about the Falcons trading back, it seems like teams like Denver picking at 20, Pittsburgh at 21, other teams picking later, Houston at 25. Josh Kendall, our good friend over at The Athletic, just put out an article on Thursday talking about, the Falcons trying to recoup, the value, getting that third round pick back that they gave up in the Matthew Judon trade last summer. And that would probably require them to move back into the 20s at some point in time. And so all of that preamble, Jarvis, to ask if, the Falcons are sitting there at 15 and, they like an edge that's sitting there. Obviously, if all the edges are gone somehow, then that certainly changes the conversation. Sure. But in a world where, 1 or 2 or 3 or more of the edges that they're potentially looking at are sitting there at 15, can this team really afford to move back given how this first round could possibly go in the immediate aftermath after they're off the clock?
The only scenario where I see the Falcons potentially trading back and having multiple options to trade back is if Shedeur falls. If Shedeur Sanders falls, they might get a deal that offer they can refuse because, hey, guess what? If they want to go back to 17 or 18, like you mentioned with Cincinnati Bengals. They want to get someone opposite Trey Henderson. What if they want Michael Williams? And the Falcons probably aren't that big on Michael Williams, and they're in love with Mike Green, and they know that who's ever in front of them, they aren't going to pick Mike Green, and he's still sitting there. Or if Donovan Ezeraku is more than likely going to be there at 18 or 19 or 17, whatever. So they say, hey, man, we want to move back. There's somebody who wants to trade up for this quarterback. Oh, yeah, well, come on about that third round pick then this year. And then we'll, maybe a fifth, third and a fifth. Come on with it. We move up a few spots and they can work it out from that standpoint. So, yeah, but as far as what's in front of them and the potential of a Mike Green being available, right? Because you got to assume that Carolina is going to hop on Jalen Walker if he's sitting right there. That'd be a fool if they don't. And then the Saints, they could be up in the air. They're a wild card, right? Because Derek Carr not going to be around there forever. Do they take a chance on Shador? I heard they really like Jackson Dart. They've been all over the quarterback situation. So it's just a lot of different scenarios. But I feel like that one piece, that one true wild card, if doggone Shador Sanders falls out of that top 5, that top 3 or whatever, somehow makes it out of that top 3, I feel like those phones are going to start ringing, Jack. And I feel like the Falcons could take advantage.
Yeah, I think that's, you talk about Shador falling. I've seen a lot of mock drafts over the last week or so where Shador does fall and he's on the available when the Falcons come on the clock at pick 15. And I've seen a lot of mock drafts that have the Cleveland Browns going all the way from 33 to 15 to get, that quarterback, that QB2, still being able to get, either Travis Hunter or Abdul Carter and still getting the quarterback of the future. Obviously, if the Browns were able to pull that off, as we discussed on the Atlanta Football Party on Locked On Sports Atlanta on Thursday, maybe that would kill the Kirk Cousins trade to the Cleveland Browns, because Kirk don't care whether it's a second overall pick or the 32nd overall pick, first round pick. He don't want no part of that. But I'm curious, would you be open to moving all the way back to pick 33 if the Browns were willing to make it worth the Falcons' while?
I would have to consider it. It depends on who's left, right? Like, I can see the Falcons really liking Ezeraku. I can see that. But like I said, there's the Tampa Bay waiting in the wings right there at 19 saying, hey, yep, come on down. We're going to put him on opposite of Yaya Diaby, and we about to go to work, baby. We about to have some fun with Falcons twice a year. So that'll be a hard one, man, to go outside of the first round. True enough, they'll be able to add some picks and they'll be able to, get some guys, but they got guys last year, what I'm saying? Like, I want the guy, to add to the guys that y'all got last year. And hopefully those guys come through for you like you thought they did. You thought they would when you drafted them, specifically Braden Trice. So I think that those are the things you have to consider. But I would answer the phone. I would have a conversation, but ultimately I have to decide whether or not, like, the guy who's sitting right in front of me, am I going to be able to get value from all those picks that will equal or better what I'm going to get from, say, a Mike Green, if he's sitting right there ready for me to turn in that card?
Yeah. Yeah, as you guys well know, I'm very much in favor of trading back if you can get, an edge rusher a few spots later and pick up some mid-round picks. That to me is the ideal scenario, because I kind of group all of those guys kind of in a similar tier. And at a certain point, it's just like, all right, I'd rather than sort of saying one guy is clearly better than the other, I'll take the lesser guy and a third round pick or whatever. And I feel like that will make up the difference. But at the same time, if the board falls
Let me ask you this. Do you trust Terry Fontenot with more picks?
No, let's say that. Not particularly.
Okay.
I mean,
All right. That's
trust
an
in
interesting way to put it.
Terry
I
in the
got you.
draft are things that just do not at this stage are hard for me to come by when it comes to having trust in what Terry Fontenot is. Not to say that Terry's the worst drafter in the history of the world. It's just
Yeah, I
I don't
understand that.
have trust that I'm going to be sitting here Thursday, Friday, Saturday of draft weekend and feeling great about the Atlanta Falcons. It's just there hasn't been enough success at this stage for me to feel like I can trust in that. But
Yeah.
um, we'll just sort of have to see how it all plays out. I wonder a little bit. And again, I think if we have the tunnel vision, or I won't speak for you, Jarvis.
Okay.
Even though I know I am speaking for you. I know
If you,
we have the tunnel vision of got to get a pass rusher in round one,
yes.
but
Agree.
because the Atlanta Falcons, speaking of trust, we don't trust that the Atlanta Falcons have that same vision.
Yes.
I certainly think trading back becomes a much more viable option if the Falcons' approach to round one isn't best pass rusher available, right? If it's just like we're just going to get the best defensive player available, then it becomes a lot easier to move back because you're willing to take any options, and there will still be good defensive players in all likelihood at positions other than pass rusher in round one if you move back, right?
Yeah, man. And that's the thing about trading back. Like you got to have somebody to dance with, right? And it got to make sense for both parties. And I don't, given this regime, because I don't want to go back in history because I'll just get depressed. Just given what Terry Fontenot's type deal, right? Traded up for Arne Ebiketie. How they work it out? I mean, what is Arne Ebiketie? Well, fine. Okay. All right. Second round pick, fine. Not really. Is he starter worthy? I don't know. I can't definitively answer that question. And that's not good when you're talking about a player that, drafted in the second round. And you got Troy Anderson. All right. Okay. I mean, I know how you feel, a little bit better than I do about his trajectory and what he's going to be in the NFL. But the fact that we're having conversations about what these guys are and they're 2-3 years into their contracts, that's not necessarily the thing that you want to be saying about second round draft picks. So I don't know if I trust Terry either. I can't trust him when it comes to that because I just look at the precedent that he set. I mean, this is where he's drafted, and that's all I have to go off of. So it's hard for me to say, man, I got Mike Green right here, but you offer me a third, a fifth this year, maybe even a draft pick next year. I don't know. Am I going to be here next year?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Can I even answer that question definitively? So, yeah, man, trade back would be great. That would be awesome. Get more picks, all that stuff. But, oh, man, am I building for another general manager? That's the question I have to ask myself. Or I'm trying to get players that can come in and win right now to keep my job so I can be here in the future.
Yeah. Well, speaking of second round picks that haven't quite lived up to the hype, let's talk about some second round picks that at least Jarvis thinks could potentially live up to the hype. And we'll talk about some of the guys that he has his eyes on for the Falcons in round two as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. The Armada Player of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, we're taking a look at a draft prospect and pick one guy that stands apart, the guy we believe showcases the strength and power needed to push the Atlanta Falcons forward. As we look ahead to next season, and this week's Armada and Clear-Cut Player of the Week is cornerback Maxwell Hairston of Kentucky. Despite being 183 pounds and running a 4.28 40, he isn't just some sleek-looking sports car at the cornerback position. When it comes to his willingness to stick his nose in there and defend the run, he plays with the ruggedness of the heavy-duty vehicle that can conquer run support. With the same capability and confidence, the Nissan Armada conquers the road. And when it comes to the Nissan Armada, we say go forth and conquer, and that's exactly what Maxwell Hairston can do here in Atlanta. And it's clear that our Player of the Week is out here ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence. just like you can in an all-new Nissan Armada or any of their outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next adventure at shopnissanusa.com. So, as I discussed at the top of today's episode, we've spent so much energy on this podcast over the last several months talking about what the Falcons should and could and can do in round one. We haven't spent nearly as much time talking about round two. That's something that I do want to, open the floor on and spend a lot more time next week talking about here on Locked On Falcons. But Jarvis, you can get this party started a little bit early and talk about some players, some prospects that you potentially have, whether you think they're realistic or, pie in the sky, whatever you want to go with, who are some guys that you're, we would be sitting here on Friday night in 2 weeks, and you're doing your little fist pump, being like, I like this pick. Who are some of those guys for you?
Of course, I'm gonna start up front, right? I gotta go with a guy like Walter Nolan. I really like what I saw against him when he played against Georgia. Man, you talking about Jared Wilson? Has the potential to be a pretty doggone good center in the NFL, even though he only had 1 year as a starter at Georgia. Man, the way he was moving him around, I love seeing that type of stuff, man. And we know Georgia's offensive line is known for just being big movers, body mass movers. And for him to move him like he did in that particular game, I just love seeing that type of stuff. So, and, there was some issues off the field or on the field, walking off the field, and when it was Walter Nolan, and, whether or not, he was pretty productive as far as he had 6.5 sacks this year with Ole Miss. So, but if a guy like that is sitting around at 46, I was like, hey, man, turning that card. Let's see what add them to the fold, because, like I said, I want waves of guys, man. Not solely on the edge. I'm talking about down in the middle too. The push in the pocket, man, can help guys like Arnie Ebiketie, who just flying off the edge and just trying to get there, right? He can walk into sacks if you got the right guys in that middle, pushing that pocket. So I feel like Walter Nolan is a guy, and another guy that really stands out to me is Maxwell Harrison, the corner out of Kentucky, long guy, a guy that can really do some different things for you. He can add to your secondary. You don't necessarily have to have him come in and start right away. Wow, Jarvis, you was just talking about second-round picks being starters, and they should be starters in the league. But when you have veterans in place already, there are some things that you can kind of play around with. And the best thing about, having guys like that depth in the secondary, man, you have options. You can move Mike Hughes inside, right, and throw Harrison on the outside, and you throw that length in that you have on both sides now with AJ Terrell as well. I think there's so many things you can play around with as far as Jeff Elbrick goes, as far as being that defensive coordinator, because when you can lock up across the board, man, there's so many things you can do. You can see K. Ellis being sent a little bit more on third and long. So, and we know we like that him and what he can do on a consistent basis when he's being sent like that. So, Jimmy Lake had to have his head beat in last year to do that, and take advantage of that. So with that type of lineup at that cornerback spot, or those type of options you have as a defensive coordinator, I feel like that can make this defense make that jump that we've been talking about. Because they don't have to be a top 10 defense, man, but top 15, 16, middle of the road defense, I'll take that all day.
Hey, I'll take low 20s, Jarvis. Right. It's been a minute since we've seen low 20s here in Atlanta. So 21 is what you're shooting for in blackjack. I'm shooting for that for this Falcons defense. Based on where we have been these last couple of years, Ryan Nielsen year withstanding. But Jarvis, we talked a lot about this team's need for an offensive tackle. We've talked a lot about if the Falcons are looking for a plug and play offensive tackle, that's a round one guy, because we talked a lot about the guy who, shall go nameless in the Kansas City Chiefs because he hadn't played good enough as a rookie, that second round pick at that left tackle spot for us to learn what his actual name is in Kingsley S is what we'll say.
There we go.
We talk about trusting with Terry Fontenot. Like, part of me just sits here, and again, maybe it's just that lack of trust in Terry Fontenot is like, the Falcons will do the thing that we want them to do in round one, take that pass rusher, and we'll be like, yeah, man, great. Terry's off to a good start. Don't ruin this, Terry. And then round two comes around, and he's like, but I got to take that offensive player. I got to take that tackle. And that to me is where I can see that going. But again, I know I have a certain mindset that, that tends to be quote unquote negative, but pessimistic, as some people call it. I don't know what they're talking about, Jarvis. I'm the most optimistic person on the planet, but I'm curious, Jarvis. All jokes aside, if the Falcons were to go offensive tackle in round two, would you feel better about that, or do you still feel like round two you got to get immediate impact defensive player still?
ID, man, that's my motto. Like, they have to go with a defensive player, whether it be a corner or another edge player, or like I talked about earlier with Walter Nolan. You have to continue to add to this defense. You can't plan out the future like that. I know they may sound preposterous that a general manager shouldn't be thinking about the future, but like, you have to. The plan is from the owner on down. The focus will be on the defense in the draft. And a lot of people who saying like, oh, he's lying. I was like, where do you think he got it from? You don't think that Terry and Raheem have said, hey, man, this is what we're thinking. Here's what we're looking at. Here's the guys that we're talking to. We're just doing our homework on these guys, just in case something crazy happened. We're just planning for Armageddon. That's the only way I see an offensive tackle going in the second round, right? Because so many guys went off the board, because so many teams value those defensive edge rushers or those defensive tackles and those corners. They just start flying off the board, like Siobhan Revel, right? Or Ravel. If he gets drafted in the first round, man, the dude has been dealing with a lot of injuries. Oh, gosh. It's going to be a run on those positions if guys like that start to go in the end of that first round. So, barring anything crazy happening, I don't want to see an offensive tackle in the second round. Absolutely not. I don't think Terry should be thinking that far ahead, because here's the thing. And I already got a lot of money invested in that offensive line already, right? I just gave Jake a couple more years. Bergeron, it looks like he's going to re-sign with his team at some point eventually, right? And then Caleb McGarry, shoot, give him a 1 or 2 year extension. I mean, who's gonna go crazy if he signs with the team for $7 or $8 million a year? I'm not gonna complain about that. So my whole thing is, go get D tackle, get another edge rusher. I'm cool with doubling down, or find that corner that you feel like they can come in and be a good addition and add some really solid, strong depth to your secondary. Because man, I know we had this conversation. I remember our conversation we had on this podcast about tackles. We had a strong conversation about offensive tackles, maybe getting a guy who can be a project. You can bring in get in the later rounds and bring them in and usher them in and work them into, and coach them up and get up under Dwayne Lefford and say, give them a year of saying, just working with coach. And then eventually come in and take over. But no, not this. Not coming in and unseat Caleb McGarry this year and be productive. Hey, man, that's crazy talk to me.
Yeah. We'll wind up talking a little bit more about tackles and options for the Falcons probably next week, as again, day two sort of options in my eyes is a little bit more realistic than the round one sort of thing. But I tend to agree with you. You got to do your homework on this draft class. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say that, like, these airplane miles are free when it comes to flying into all the pro days and the private workouts and all this stuff. But I'm sure Arthur Blank
You're
is
expense. You write it off.
it's like, hey, take the jet, go ahead,
Yeah.
take the limo down the Hartsfield, take that Uber down the Hartsfield,
Yeah,
and
man.
and fly out to God knows where. If I was gonna go off at the deep end, take the yacht. No, it's like probably not saying take the yacht, but
Nah,
you know what I'm saying.
yeah.
So
They draft Abdul Carter. You know what I'm saying?
yeah, take the yacht. Yeah, take the yacht. But yeah, it's just one of those things where it's like, do your homework. Like there's nothing, there's no downside to doing the work on as many players as possible. I remember in that 23 draft where they were looking at a lot of the top wide receivers in that draft. They didn't draft a wide receiver that year, but they looked at Jackson Smith and Jigba. They looked at Quentin Johnson and Jordan Addison and all those guys at the top of that draft, and it made people think, oh, are the Falcons going to use a number one pick on a wide receiver? No, they didn't use any picks on a wide receiver. So it's one of those things where, I think when we look at all the players that the Falcons are interested in, and people sort of assuming, hey, that means they're going to draft that guy. And it's like, maybe we'll see. But like, basically doing your homework is free. Due diligence doesn't cost you a thing, right?
Nope.
And not doing your due diligence could cost you quite a bit. So we'll see how the Falcons approach that. But we'll wrap up today's episode talking about the man himself, D. Alford, and the fact that the Falcons were willing to bring him back. What does that mean for the potential to go after someone like a Maxwell Harrison or a cornerback high in this year's draft? And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Well, Jarvis, since we last spoke, the Falcons re-signed D. Alford to a 1-year contract. And the Falcons are really doubling down on, let's just run it back with basically the same roster that we had a year ago. It just seemed to be like every chance they can be like, we could do something different. And it's like, no, we're just going to do the same thing. And so, I don't need you to speak on D. Alford. We everybody has an opinion on D. Alford. It was expressed many, many times in the month of December, particularly after that game, yeah. But shout out to Jordan Addison, Pitt legend.
Goodness gracious.
But the fact that the Falcons are basically their top 4 corners from last year, and Terrell, Hughes, Phillips, and Alford are all back. Are you reading anything into that in terms of what the Falcons are planning to do when it comes to potentially upgrading that cornerback spot? Because I agree with you 100%, Jarvis, that in order to make this pass rush work, you want to be a little bit stouter on the back end so that you can be a little bit more aggressive on the front end. And K-Nell still probably still argue as we sit here today. Again, maybe people disagree with me, but hopefully we'll have a different conversation in 2 weeks. But Kayla is still probably the best guy on your front that you're like, I need him to get after the quarterback, and like that's a problem. But we spent 3 months talking about that. So
yes, we did.
What are your thoughts on the cornerback room now that D. Alford's back?
To me, I think it signifies that there's going to be a true competition at the nickel spot, given how the roster is currently constructed. I'm not talking about them drafting anybody or anything like that. Clark Phillips and D. Alford, right? It kind of almost reminds me of the Matt Hennessy and Drew Dahlman conversation, because I was kind of more so leaning to the Matt Hennessy side. And then once Drew Dahlman put on a little bit more weight, he started getting a little bit more stout. And I realized that, hey, the current regime drafted him. So more than likely, they're going to always, if it's a tie, they're going to lean towards the guy that they drafted. So here we are. Clark Phillips, they drafted you. Hey, D. Alford, and I said that D. Alford there was still a chance that he could re-sign with his team because the guy got experience. And you putting him up against the guy that you drafted in the mid-round, hey man, go beat him. If you beat him, hey, there's a possibility that D. Alford won't be on this team, especially if you beat them out in the spring and say they like what they see lining up at inside. Ryan Moore said it himself. Hey, man, we're going to move you inside. and we're gonna start that April 22nd with voluntary workout start. That's where you're gonna be working. So hey, you better get ready. And I think that if Clark Phillips is up to the task, that helps the Falcons out a lot because you won't be so pressed to try to get a corner in that second round, because we know for a fact they're going to draft the edge rush in the first round, right? That's free guarantee, all that stuff. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I think that them bringing Alford back signifies that, hey, Clark, go out and win the job, man. It's on you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. A real competition.
Yeah.
And we'll see. Yeah. If Clark is up to the task, this is. Yeah, I guess bringing back the Alford is
feel that way.
What was that?
Seems like you don't feel that Clark Phillips is up to task.
No, we'll see. I'm not sold on Clark Phillips is what I'll say, but the bar ain't high.
I'm not sold on him being on the outside.
Yeah. I've always thought that if he was going to make it as a long-term starter in this league, it was going to be as a nickel, not as an outside corner. But
sure,
we haven't quite seen that at this point. But I think you bring a good point that bringing back D. Alford is less a D. Alford thing than maybe it's more of a Clark Phillips thing of basically like, okay, here's the bar. You got to get up above here.
Yeah, it's low, and it's low too. Yeah, it's low. Just go out and beat him. Be better than him, and then we'll figure out the rest from here. Because at the end of the day, man, most time teams are going to skew towards the guys that they brought in. Right? D. Alford was brought in the previous regime. I mean, I know Terry was still here, but they collaborate so much. When it comes to personnel, that Arthur, he might have been Arthur Smith guy. Or he might have been a Terry guy. We'll never know.
Well, it's funny. It's funny that you say that, because I remember when they brought in D. Alford from the CFL, the Canadian Football League. Everybody's like, that's a Terry guy, because Terry's got the pro personnel on lock. That's the Terry guy. And when D. Alford was playing well, it was like, oh, Terry's doing great work. He's getting these CFL guys. And now D. Alford's not playing so well. That's an Arthur Smith guy.
That's why I don't like this whole collaboration bull crap. I can't even get it out. Because you don't know who to blame sometimes, right? I mean, I blame Kirk Cousins on Raheem Morris because hey, that man trying to win now. I'm sure Terry was sold on him, but I'm sure Rob like, man, I need an elite processor. Most of the time, they don't come in as rookie quarterbacks having that label, right? So yeah, man, it's a lot of things that go with the whole collaboration piece. I understand it, but I don't like it when I have to talk about it. Because like, who vouched for this guy? Who vouched for that guy? Who vouched for Troy Anderson? Who vouched for Arne Ebiketie? I had to throw Arne Ebiketie in there because I don't want you to get all sensitive and stuff about Troy, because I know how you feel about Troy. I know he has a nice place in your heart. I know you feel a certain type of way about him.
Hey, man.
I know you're not going to take the bait. But
I'm not going to take the bait. We got to wrap this bad boy up.
Yes. I'll be quiet
now. I will spend 3 episodes next week talking about how Troy Anderson is going to be great next week on the podcast. So stay tuned for that, guys. No, I'm kidding. I don't know.
I can't wait for those episodes.
Yeah, I don't know how
long those are. They're gonna be short.
Energy we're gonna give Troy Anderson over the next 3 months here on the podcast, but we'll see.
Got 3 shorts for you for Troy Anderson next week.
So make sure you make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out to get your Troy Anderson, your round 2 content, as well as getting in on talking more about these corners. We spend so much time talking about the edge rushers. Let's talk about some of these other positions of need for the Atlanta Falcons and some potential draft targets. And of course, that's all in store for you as your first listen on Locked On Falcons in the coming days and weeks. So continue to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, if you want to get even more insight that isn't just about what the Atlanta Falcons may or may not do in the draft, Locked On NFL Draft Podcast has you covered with Keith Sanchez, Damian Parson, giving you the lowdown on some of the top players and some of the sleepers and all that stuff on the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.